Greetings! I'm Charlie, and welcome to another process video where I talk you through how I created a piece of art from beginning to end. And this time, it's fan art of a chapter of my Star Wars fan fiction. I had a pretty clear idea of which specific moment I wanted to depict from the fan fiction, and that made it really easy to come up with a composition for the art. And yes, that's me in all my selfie glory, but I knew what I wanted, so I just used myself as the model instead of spending hours searching for images that probably were going to match up with what I wanted anyway. Sometimes you are your own best resource, even if you don't look exactly like the character you're trying to draw, which I'll come back to later. I used this orange rectangle divided into 9 smaller rectangles to help me position my characters in the frame. I knew I wanted to do landscape because I embed the art in my fanfic on Archive of Our Own, and landscape just works better for the flow of reading, in my opinion. Plus, it's a little more cinematic, which is appropriate because this 3x3 grid and the 4 places where the lines intersect are common composition tools not only in comics but also in movies. Of course, as with everything, it's not so much a rule as it is a guideline, so use it or break it as you intentionally see fit. I ended up canting the references, aka my selfies, at an angle to make sure they fit in frame, and also because it looked cool. After I had the references where I wanted them, I did a quick and dirty trace with a charcoal brush to guide the line art. Using a charcoal brush, which is thicker and varies in opacity a lot more than the pencil sketching brush I normally use, has completely changed how I draw in, like, all the best ways. It forces me to stop getting caught up in the details and focus more on the shapes, and it's just like such a more pleasant and freeing experience while drawing, and I wish I had tried it years ago. Drawing really angular objects like this Republic Commando sidearm are a pain, but because I'm a costumer, I was very happy to take advantage of a prop I owned and could position exactly where I wanted without having to deal with perspective lines and all that good stuff. I thought about doing another sketch on top of the mannequins, as I like to call them, but partly to save time because I'm trying to work faster in general and partly just to see what would happen, I jumped right into inking. I'm also pretty familiar with these characters and how to draw them, so that was another reason I didn't feel like spending additional time on an extra sketch. This first character here on the left is my Mandalorian original character. Her name is Ordeyn, and she is a character that I have known and cosplayed for well over a decade now. Some of you may be wondering how I've had a Mandalorian character for more than 10 years when the show of the same name only came out in 2019, or maybe you're thinking about Sabine from Ahsoka last year, or the animated show Rebels in 2014, or maybe still the animated show The Clone Wars when Mandalorians showed up in 2010. Well, none of these shows were actually the first appearance of Mandalorians in Star Wars. There used to be this thing called the Expanded Universe, rebranded as Legends around the time of the Disney takeover for all things Star Wars that weren't the movies, like books, comics, and video games. While the Expanded Universe content was never officially considered canon, it was still chock full of great stories and characters, both familiar and new. The way I primarily engaged in the Expanded Universe was through the more than 100 books written by different science fiction authors over the course of 35 years. So before anyone floods the comments with, "This is the way," and "She took her helmet off," just know that there have been many different versions of Mandalorian culture presented over the last 20-odd years, and my Mandalorian comes from the culture established in the books. Also, just in case anybody forgot, Star Wars is all pretend. So remember to be kind to each other. Ordeyn is what people in the fanfiction community would probably call a self-insert, wherein authors essentially write themselves into a narrative through a fictional character. But the traits that Ordeyn and I share are mostly restricted to physical appearance, which will become clear as the art progresses. She is very much her own person, separate from me, though I do draw on my own life experiences and perceptions to depict her in writing and art. Most artists would probably agree that there's a little bit of themselves in most of what they create, so imbuing a character with both good and bad qualities that I see in myself is nothing out of the ordinary, and probably something we can't help but do sometimes. The character on the right, which some of you probably figured out by now or could have guessed just based on the art I throw out on the internet, we have good old Goggles, otherwise known as Tech from the animated show Star Wars: The Bad Batch. Tech is a canon character from the Clone Wars or prequel era. He's a clone trooper, but a genetically modified clone trooper, so he looks different from the template Jango Fett along with the rest of his squad, Clone Force 99. If it wasn't obvious from my reference selfies, I am neither particularly tall nor am I broad-shouldered. Tech, on the other hand, is both of these things, so I really am only using the mannequin of myself as a loose template. Which is still incredibly helpful because it provided me with the necessary visual information to draw the character in the position that I wanted and the perspective that I was aiming for. You might have noticed in the reference photo I took of myself for Tech that I bulked up my form a bit with a long-sleeve shirt. This made it easier to translate Tech's more masculine shape to my less masculine one. So if you're struggling to find reference material, do not be afraid to use yourself as the model, even if you look nothing like whatever it is that you want to draw. Having something to go off of may be better than having nothing. Because I worked out the pose in real life, I didn't have to invent anything new on the canvas that I didn't want to for Tech. The only two adjustments I made from my mannequin were drawing the edge of his near shoulder further out from my own and using the transform tool to stretch the mannequin to make it a little wider. I didn't have to rebuild his torso from scratch or even really think about anatomy because my reference selfie gave me everything I needed to accomplish my goal, which is some kind of like work harder, not smarter thing, but mostly just learn how to be okay with getting it done instead of trying to make it perfect. The one thing that I felt wasn't working for Tech was the angle of the head on the mannequin. The perspective of these two characters doesn't perfectly line up at the end of the day, but that was kind of inevitable because I was taking pictures of myself and I'm only one person. But getting it perfect isn't the point, as previously stated, and probably, with the exception of anyone watching this video, because I'm pointing it out, nobody's gonna notice. So it was necessary to rebuild Tech's head, which I do in blue with my new favorite brush, the charcoal brush, but I'll take, like, only having to redraw a head over reworking an entire body any day. Give me that, I'll take it. Plus it made good practice for me since making characters look like themselves consistently is an ongoing skill I'm learning, and a lot of that comes from fine-tuning subtle relationships between elements of the face, like where his goggles sit on his head, and then where his eyes are positioned inside of the lenses, so on and so forth. After I finished Tech's inks, I came back to Ordeyn because I felt like her outfit was too plain compared to Tech's, which I sort of invented on the spot. So I took a minute to try to make it more interesting, but also more Star Wars-y or Swarzy, as we say, meaning adding or removing stuff until it becomes something that looks like it belongs in the Star Wars aesthetic. It still ends up looking a bit generic sci-fi for me, but it was better than it was at first, so I called it good and moved on. The fan art you're watching me make in this video is actually for the third chapter of my fanfic. I've already done the art for the first chapter and will eventually do the art for the second chapter. But in the first one I really liked how I had the characters breaking out of the panel that was behind them. And I wanted to keep that going in future pieces, and it really ends up looking nice when it's embedded in the text of the fanfic on the webpage. And speaking of the art for chapter 1, I snagged a quick and dirty screenshot of that art to make color picking a breeze for the flatting stage, aka when we add solid colors to the inks. I apologize ahead of time for all the zooming in and out at this stage. It's a necessary evil for making sure I'm not missing any pixels when I fill areas. Krita has this super handy setting for the fill tool where it will fill areas while paying attention to the pixels of other visible layers and respect those boundaries. So even though I'm adding my flat colors on a layer beneath my inks, when I have that setting selected, I can fill in my inks while also preserving my inks, since the fill is being done in a separate layer without having to use a selection tool. This is not the only way to flat a painting in Krita or in general, but it's become a part of my workflow, so I thought I'd point it out to you. I'm done drawing, I've got my inks, everything's flatted. Why did I pull the references back out? Well, I actually really liked the lighting that's in the references. The moment in the fanfic I decided to depict takes place sometime after midday, so the sun would be more or less high in the sky, much like the office light above my head in the photos. So to not only use these selfies for the poses and the perspective, I also got to use them as a guide for how to apply light and shadow to the characters. These selfies are terrible, but they are, at least in this context, the gift that keeps on giving. One of the reasons I like flatting my art in not just more comic book styles like this one, but even in more realistic styles, is because it makes it really easy for me to create transparency masks around the art so that it is impossible for me to paint quote-unquote outside the lines. The way I do this is by copying my flats to a new layer, which covers the same area that I would want to be painting inside of anyway, setting the alpha lock to true, which tells the brush to only paint where there are already pixels on that layer. I color the whole area in white, and then I convert that layer to a transparency mask. Because I recolored all the pixels on that layer in white, the transparency mask knows immediately which area I want showing through and then which ones I don't. And if you look at my layers over on the right side, you'll see a thumbnail that is mostly black with a silhouette of the character in white. And we will only be seeing what comes through the white area, and then everything in black will be hidden. Hence the phrase masking. I group this transparency mask with what will become the highlights and the shadows, and then kind of a bonus thing for me, the secondary light source, so that the mask applies only to those layers because I don't want it interrupting the original flats or the inks. And that layer, or that group, will be between the inks and the flats. At some point, I will have a tutorial on how to do all of that, so keep an eye out if I don't already have one by the time I post this video. When it comes to adding highlights and shadows to art, there are a lot of different techniques out there, which is great because we want to have options to meet our needs, depending on our constraints like time or style, but it can also be overwhelming to have too many options. The method I employ here, which I call shading with layer modes, lends itself well to a more comic book style. It's pretty quick to apply, and it's very flexible and non-destructive. If you are unfamiliar with layer modes, they're just various ways that we can dictate how the layers interact with one another. These interactions, as far as I understand it, are determined mathematically. Using layer modes is using math, baby. I am all about that. Before that scares you off from using layer modes, though, you do not have to understand the underlying equations that calculate the resulting layer interactions. There are a lot of different layer modes, and if you want to know how they work the way that they do, that information is out there. I just don't have it on hand. I'm just going to show you how to use a few of the layer modes, and I encourage everyone to learn through play. Try some layer modes out for yourself, mess around, see if you can figure out how they work just by using them, and then there'll be a tool in your artistic toolbox that you may find comes in handy in the future. For the highlights, I set the mode of the layer to which I'll be adding the highlights to screen. I drop the opacity on that layer, then I pick a yellowish color. I will sometimes use the overlay mode instead, depending on what works best. And I know a lot of other artists like to use overlay rather than screen, so you have kind of options, common options there for adding highlights to your work. I go through a bit of trial and error, adjusting the opacity of the screen layer and finding a yellowish color that works the way I wanted it to, because the layer mode is combining the color in my brush with the colors of the layers underneath. It's going to produce slightly different results with each color on my flats layer. This is great because we want that variety, but it can also take some tweaking to get it to look just right. The more I looked at my reference photos, the more I liked that bluish light on the left, which was natural light from my office window. I wanted to try implementing this secondary light source in my art. It did take a lot of fiddling, but I'm pretty happy with the end result for it not being something I'd done before. And in order to do that, I ended up using the overlay mode on a layer with a bright blue brush color and a slightly lowered opacity. For the shadows, I pretty much always go with the multiply layer mode, which is also probably the most commonly used layer mode for shadows as far as I'm aware. Most people use like a light purple in their brush with this mode, but what I found worked for me in this specific instance was a dark purplish gray. With Ordeyn's shading done, I moved on to text. One of the fun things about shading is that it provides us an opportunity to add a little more dimension to the characters beyond the lines we picked out in the inks. For example, even though my inks don't depict Tech's abdominal muscles, I was able to use the highlights to add this element to his character for some visual interest in what was a relatively bland area. The other new thing I tried out in this piece was using both soft and hard edges on the highlights and shadows. In real life, highlights and shadows don't come to clean, crisp lines, and even though the style I'm using here is not realistic, adding that gradient to one side of the shadows, like furthest away from the light source, and the highlights gave everything a more dynamic sense of depth. I used an airbrush to accomplish this, both applying and erasing color. It took a bit longer than I wanted it to, and when I try it again, I'll spend some time figuring out if there's a different way or a different brush or something that I could use to make it work better for me. I also realized that I completely forgot to add shadows to Tech's face, probably because I was distracted by messing with filters on the secondary light source layer to see if I could make it fuzzy kind of in a satisfactory way, none of which I ended up using, but it's important to try things out even if you're not sure about it, because at least you'll learn what doesn't work, and that is still useful information to have. I went for a very simple background for this piece, which was kind of by design because I knew that up angle was going to show more of the sky than anything else, and I have not figured out a way to enjoy drawing buildings. Besides just a gradient for the sky, I added some cute little clouds with a poor man's fisheye effect. I didn't use fisheye anywhere else in this piece, so it doesn't really make sense, but my hope was that it would benefit the upward angle of the overall perspective. Again, guidelines, not rules. And here's what the final piece looks like, all cropped up and signed and with some text and stuff that I put in there. If you want to read this fic, you can check the link in the description. Go for it. It's really just for fun. It does contain adult content, so fair warning there, but it is publicly available on AO3 Archive of Our Own. Hopefully some part of this video was helpful to you, or showed you something you hadn't seen before, or was at the very least just entertaining. I do have a playlist of art tutorials that I am continually adding to, so if you are interested in learning how to do digital art, definitely check those out. If there is anything you would like to see me do in the future, let me know. I'm glad you showed up, and thank you so much for watching.